Dr. Haggerty, Dr. Neufeld, it is a true honor to have both of you on this podcast today because you are such leading experts. I nerd out about psychology and psychiatry all the time, so to have both of you here is just like, I feel like a kid in a candy store. But we're here to talk about a very serious topic here in Canada, medical assistance in dying. I wanted to begin with this question that many Canadians may not even know, which is Bill C. Bill C. Bill C says that one's natural death in Canada does not need to be reasonably foreseeable in order to be eligible for medical assistance in dying. Now, many Canadians might think that there needs to be some reasonable foreseeableness in order to access MAiD, but that's not what Bill C says, and I'd love to start the conversation there. Why do you think our government included that option as part of medical assistance in dying?
You want me to start, Dr. Neufeld? Okay.
Yes, I think you should.
Yeah. Well, a couple qualifiers that I'm sure Karin would comment on. We're not legal experts, and though we've had representation on Parliament, our representation as academic chairs has really only occurred in probably the last 8 to 9 months. We've had or 12 months, we've had direct communication with Parliament, but we did not engage as an academic representation as chairs until the initiated or contributed to the first delay of MAiD that happened in December of 20. Yeah, sounds right. So to be a non-legal response to that, many of the influences that have contributed, in my understanding, and Karin may have more to add, I'm sure, is that it was compelled because of case law that was compelling law to change to reflect that. So the Truchon case was probably one of several that had come to the courts, of which some of our colleagues did present at, where the not foreseeable death option was raised, and that was not challenged by the federal government when it had the rights to do that, or had its reasons to not, but it certainly had an opportunity to challenge what would have been a lower court law that was not appealed at the Superior Court to higher court, and that compelled the Parliament to kind of fast track a conversation about moving from the original MAiD for end of life, let's say comfort, palliative sedation, terminal sedation concept, to we can move it up the pathway of health and illness much higher. And I certainly think many of us, Karin and I included, we do feel that was certainly a confounding and unfortunate, actually, because it's led to a whole lot of complexities, of which MAiD for mental illness, as we'll get to on irremediableness, that it is these decisions are inherent because we don't deal with terminal illness in psychiatry. We're not like a cancer care. Some would argue we are, but that would be my answer to, we were compelled as a country to move in that direction, and it was probably under challenged at the federal court level to let's have a fair dialogue.
Neufeld.
Yeah, as I was alluding to earlier in our conversation, I think that actually these reasons that people have for including individuals really, I think, at the end of the day, comes from a really good place. People want to be helpful, people want to relieve suffering, and that, the underlying objective of the law was indeed to relieve suffering. The problem is always in the implementation and the implication as to how it will be applied in a broader society. And so I think that is what Dr. Haggerty is getting at here. I don't think it's been well considered. I don't think it's been carefully thought out what the implications are for people within our society when all of a sudden we're saying anyone with a health condition that's irremediable, i.e. anybody with any kind of disability, therefore, really should be eligible for MAiD if they're suffering. And that, while MAiD have come from a good place in someone's heart, it's really got some pretty dire consequences when you think about the implementation of such a law.
Dr. Neufeld, I want to pick up on that implementation piece. What do you see as some of the major challenges with implementation when we include language that includes irremediability in it as well?
Right. Well, that's precisely where Dr. Haggerty and other chairs of academic departments in Canada have been writing letters and trying to make our voices heard. That if you look at the data on mental illnesses, while many mental illnesses, it can be argued, are chronic and will not be cured, it is very, very difficult to come to any sort of agreement amongst practitioners and amongst scientists as to what irremediability might mean. If, for example, you defined it as not being able to improve in your level of symptoms, we have very clear data that suggests that physicians and psychiatrists are very, very poor at predicting who is going to be worse off, the same, or better in a given period of time. And so trying to make decisions about whether somebody should be put to death, because that's what this is all about, state-sponsored death, it's really difficult if the very basis of the law is based on irremediability. And yet, even those of us who've been working in this field for so many decades and are very experienced and very good clinicians, I myself included, won't be able to predict who will be worse off, say, in 3 months' time or in a year's time. So I think that's one aspect of this. Of course, there are other aspects of this, but that's one of the most fundamentally difficult aspects of this law to implement.
Dr. Haggerty.
Would you like me to pick that up? Pick up the Yeah, well, I think there were a few things that confronted us as psychiatrists, and Dr. Neufeld alludes to it. Is does this match with what the kind of the core nature of our training or the core environment that we worked in? It is quite it's a foreign entity, really. I think the concept of us being able to actually determine those that will respond or not, those that of which we never conceived ourselves as playing that kind of a prognosis game. I mean, we do have some good information, but we knew in mental health and psychiatry, there's so many variables at play. Our ability to make these predictions was never a science like 5-year mortality for Duke's class B, 4B, colon cancer. That wasn't the nature of our rubric. And I think this certainly was a foreign partner for us in psychiatry. And the irony was, Chris, is that I think it cascaded through the physical medicine area quite quickly without really the window. We really feel that the dialogue on the mental health, soul mental illness category of Bill C-14C7, we kind of stretched it out. And in my discussion with our chronic pain and physical rehab colleagues or palliative care, because I think those two subspecialty areas are uniquely affected by this, I suspect if they had a chance to roll back time, they would really have wished for a deeper conversation and to slow down the conversation, because if you ever watch any of the parliamentary, we have spent more time talking about this subject than 3 times more than we ever did for the original. What does that say about Canada's approach to policy review? So I think that Dr. Neufeld has mentioned irremediability, and then we have the issue of suicidality. And as an entity, it's often difficult to distinguish. And the third had to do with kind of alternates to this. If indeed psychiatrists mostly saw requests for MAiD as variant of a suicidal intent, then what do we do about that? We don't really have sufficient infrastructure for existing suicidality. We tend to admit individuals that want to end their life. And indeed, I can recall, as Karin probably can, the individuals who you think they would have asked for MAiD and that we would have admitted them and waited it out, that the people that stopped eating or did other things. And I think we saw that within our domain of required good clinical care, to help an individual move to a place of hopefulness. And Dr. Neufeld's alluded to it, is that so that gets removed from the agenda for us, or it's a side kind of hidden conversation, or maybe not so hidden now. So we don't have the means in which we were ready for trainees to kind of navigate that. We don't have an example is what we call walks you through. So Chris, are you depressed now? Oh, well, how is your appetite? So we had structured interview processes that it would take 10 to 14 questions before we would ever consider a diagnosis of depression. And then you would have to compare that. We didn't have that kind of structured approach at all, Karin, that I know of, that was even hinting at distinguishing this. And those were kind of the two, I'd say, dominant themes that allowed leverage to slow it down, to convince the politicians to say, hold on here, the advice you've been given so far might be a little more on the activist minimization. So that I thought, and I'd like to say that the other areas of medicine probably didn't get that same opportunity, and I suspect they would want. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it certainly allowed me to say something that I think was relevant.
Dr. Neufeld, any follow-up on that?
Yeah, I think those are really good points that Jack has really broadened the conversation about all of the various ways that this can go wrong in terms of implementation. And absolutely, there's been a lot of discussion amongst us, the chairs of psychiatry, and in fact, even members within the government. Senator Kuchar, for example, is a strong believer that anyone who's well trained can tell the difference between a patient who is suicidal and a patient who's asking for MAiD. And we respectfully disagree heartily with Dr. Kuchar. I think my training is just as good as his. And I would say, no, I can show you many, many situations, in fact, even in clinic this week, where patients are saying, things like they are requesting MAiD, and they're going to request MAiD as soon as it's available. Now they're quite frustrated with us that it's not available. But in fact, they are really ill and they need treatment. And I'm grateful to have a little bit of time to actually intervene and try to get them better, as are their family members, by the way. So, that just sort of highlights the fact that these are opinions that people have brought to this discussion that have no bearing in any scientific way on the policy that's being considered for implementation still in 3 years. So we're not without this policy. And in fact, I'd also like to point to what Jack has already alluded to, I think, as well, that we have what's referred to as track 2, which is, as Jack was describing, those non-foreseeable deaths due to conditions that are chronic, but where death is not necessarily foreseeable in the immediate future. I think that probably we as a society, I would like to see us reconsider that process as well. Because quite frankly, we already have heard from some of our colleagues. I don't think I'm at liberty to tell the stories that some of our colleagues have told us. But what I can say in a general way is that people with psychiatric conditions are in fact accessing MAiD right now through track 2, which is very concerning to me. That means if they have some other medical condition, but it's their psychiatric condition that maybe is driving it, their sense of hopelessness and futility. For conditions like eating disorders, for example, and other sorts of conditions like chronic pain conditions, where we know again that actually we can bring a lot of treatment and a lot of hope to these conditions. And I'm very concerned that we're losing people unnecessarily already in this country. And given the numbers, the very sharp rise in the numbers of death, such that Canada has really quite a reputation at this point for being one of the countries with the highest death rates proportionally, really is very concerning.
Certainly. In fact, the numbers are quite shocking when you start looking at them, particularly in Quebec, which we can talk about today. But Dr. Neufeld, it's like you saw my outline of questions and took the questions because that was precisely what I was going to ask both you and Dr. Haggerty. Many Canadians may not know about Track 2 for MAiD, that your death does not need to be reasonably foreseeable in order to access MAiD. So perhaps I would ask both Dr. Neufeld and Dr. Haggerty, walk me through what Track 2 means. Let's say my death is not reasonably foreseeable. What would still qualify me for MAiD? And I'd also like to ask the quickness, the speed at which I can receive MAiD, because I understand it's quite it's quite urgent that I can receive MAiD in Track 2, and I want to confirm that with both of you.
I'll defer to Jeff, I think, on this one.
Well, Track 2 was the one area in which a wait time does apply. So you still have to have the features of capacity. You have to have an irremediable condition, intolerable suffering, and leaving something out here. And you're not required to have death imminent. I mean, in Track 2. So what's happened is individuals that are making an application. An example would be the infamous case of someone applying with diabetes and blindness in one eye, where there was a man in his mid-30s, and this was written up in the Globe and Mail, and they had applied. They had a wait time that's so they fulfilled the features and retracted at the last minute. So there was a wait time, and it used to be 90 days. I believe it's still 90 days, but I may be shortened. But so Track 2 allowed conditions that were not. So an example is people that have a diagnosis of Huntington's disease, but they're not at end stage. They may be able to apply for this. So they have chosen that they get assessed by two individuals. So they're supposed to be individual assessors that are supposed to be separately kind of doing that. Sometimes actually two assessors are present for the same conversation, but they're seen as individual assessors. The activating referent has to be a physician or nurse practitioner. They don't need to be specialists in that area. So that was one of the things that was kind of lower on our list of concerns. So if you had a mental illness, or in this case, rheumatoid arthritis or diabetes, you didn't need to have an internal medicine make the decision unless the assessors felt or the referring physician felt it was required. So the idea of specialist care. So those are kind of the big items. So what the big thing that differs is all those other qualifiers, except there was a wait time and a not foreseeable death category that separated some from Track 1 to Track 2. As Karin alludes to, you can move into Track 2 if you are, and often what happens is another parallel condition is seen as interpreted as being this person is nearer to death than we think. And this was one of our challenges, Christopher, the interpretation. If anything came out of the most recent cycle of parliamentary review, it was really left up to the assessing threshold of the assessors, of their threshold of perceived suffering and perception of terminality, let's say, or irremediability. And that's really a big issue. The thresholds were critiqued, and we, in a sense, our opinions of that critique seem to hold sway. And I think these are serious concerns. But we know of cases of osteoarthritis, which is not a terminal illness. We know people with glaucoma, people with, well, in our world, I had a presentation less than a year ago, on obsessive compulsive disorder. Christopher, we all probably know people with those. It's not a terminal illness. It's a difficult illness. It's one in which waxes and wanes, and no doubt there's suffering in it. But it was never on our radar, and I'm sure Karin would agree. I was kind of, gobsmacked when I heard that. So these were things that were proposed in our area, but that's what Track 2 would be. So I'm doing a long-winded answer to your question.
This is great, and thank you, Dr. Haggerty, for that. I wanted to actually pick up on what both of you have been alluding to as my next segment in this podcast, which is evidence of psychiatric recovery. And this is a topic that I love nerding out about because it just provides so much hope whenever you're going through major ups and downs in life. And the research just gets me so amped up and wanting to live life. But before I get all excited about that, I'm going to go back to what both of you assigned in November 20 to the Joint Committee on MAiD to the House of Commons. In this report back, or in this response to the House, it states, as chairs of multiple departments of psychiatry with years of experience in clinical practice, suicide research expertise, and responsibility for education and training of psychiatrists, we strongly recommend a pause on expanding MAiD to include mental disorders as a sole underlying condition. As a society, we need to provide hope and support to people during periods of despair and darkness. In our experience, people recover from long periods of suffering from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, addictions with appropriate evidence-based treatments. We strongly believe that making MAiD available for mental disorders will facilitate unnecessary deaths in Canada and negatively impact suicide prevention efforts. Doctors, I wanted to ask you, for those that may not be aware, what is the most fascinating, interesting, compelling example you have of evidence of psychiatric recovery that you have seen in your own practice or in your own career?
Well, we, of course, take care of people with when we talk about psychiatric illness, we're talking about a whole vast array of conditions that arise from behaviors such as addiction and eating disorders, for example, conditions that arise from likely a disease, a brain disease, a neurologic brain disease, conditions such as schizophrenia. We, of course, take care of people who experience very, very bad life events and have very frightening and intrusive sorts of mental phenomena such as PTSD, but a host of life experiences where people really need help managing those kinds of experiences. So these are a whole array of conditions that we treat, and they all have their own sorts of epidemiology, who gets them, when do they get them, what's the vulnerability, and their own, really every individual really has their own trajectory back to health. And so it's very, very hard to generalize. I think, though, that it's really important that, all of these conditions, and I guess one of the sort of groups that I traditionally think about also are the dimensional sorts of conditions that we have. So when people have, various kinds of personality styles, and sometimes our style of personality gets us in a whole lot of trouble. Now, do we change people's personalities? No, of course not. But you know what? We have really good treatments for all of these kinds of conditions. People with very severe and persistent substance use disorders can absolutely get better. I used to work in a methadone treatment program in the middle of East Baltimore, and I can tell you some really beautiful examples of people turning their lives around. People that, in fact, I didn't know exactly how we were going to help them, but given the chance to have contact with an individual will continue to try to work with us. We can together find a way through, and we can offer that kind of hope and kind of ideas that people are looking for in terms of trying to get better and trying to find a way forward and find joy in their life. And of course, this is true with the conditions that we treat that are more disease-like, conditions like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. These are, of course, very, very severe conditions sometimes. And so sometimes it takes a long time to get better. And admittedly, there are things that we still need to do more for. We need to understand better and bring better treatments. But this is one of the things that I talked to when we came to testify in front of the Liberal caucus. I think I've frozen here.
Okay.
So can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm just going to continue on.
Sure.
So one of the things that I told the Liberal caucus is that, I've had the chance to work at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and We had patients coming from all over the world, and we had a lot of patients from East Baltimore whom we took care of. And lots of people had been given up on by other doctors, and we took care of them. And, I have to say, it wasn't rocket science. It wasn't anything that special. It was really a careful attention to taking a careful history, to being good at what we're trained to do, being, doing a careful exam, establishing a good relationship with the person and their families, and learning from their families and loved ones about things that maybe hadn't been inquired about before. And then being consistent and applying the kinds of treatments that are readily available most often would actually end up in finding a way forward for the individual. These are all things we can do in our small communities in Canada. We just need a lot more commitment to providing those services to people where they live so that they don't have to wait 6 months to a year to see a specialist and then only see them once and then be, turfed back to somebody else who's still not prepared to take care of them. We really just need a lot more commitment to very basic care for people in the community. And that's where we should really be spending our advocacy and our energies. And if we're going to have a new program, that's where we should be spending our monies. And yes, we should be spending more monies on mental health.
Very interesting, Dr. Neufeld. I have a series of follow-ups, but before I get there, Dr. Haggerty, any examples you have? I'm sure you have a wealth of information of psychiatric interventions that led to positive outcome.
Well, yeah, I do. I'll mention, I can probably two stand out, but I'll start with the first one. The first one is someone with, I'm wondering, Karin, if you want to turn your camera off and maybe boot it up again, or I'm not sure what'll help there, but
Yeah.
The first had to do with a fellow I haven't seen for a number of years, but he was an example where, if you know that sometimes one of the issues had to do with how long do you wait for mental illness before it reaches a threshold, and some were saying 1 year, 2 years before we perceive that as a irreversible condition or such and such. And I'll tell the story about someone who I saw at soon after he reached the adult qualifying list. He was 17 to 18, was mute. He was a fellow who was never a high performer in high school, but developed at age 16 progressive deterioration of mental functioning, some hallucinations, and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Failed trials on common antipsychotics. And when I saw him, the child psychiatrist wasn't comfortable with using what we call our third line, which is clozapine. And it took this gentleman probably 7 years. So he went from being basically not communicating verbally, having almost non-self-care skills. Many of the ADLs, activities of daily living, loss, the mother had to do very much for him because of what we call the prominent negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And so when I started this medication, I had enough familiarity with it to kind of say, okay, we're in for a longer haul here. So you see him at baseline, you see him at 1 year, he has a few words. You see him at year 2, he's got sentences. You see him at year 3, he's actually leaving the house with some moderate skills of interpersonally. By year 4 and 5, he's now in supported employment and contemplating, a course at college. And again, he continued over a 5-year period to go. And just imagine if this 17-year-old or a parent was seeing this as a death sentence, or seeing it as he's going to be like this. And 3 months, like our perception is antibiotics. If I'm not better in a week, what's so that was one lesson on the longitudinal window of our condition. The other was a new treatment called transcranial magnetic stimulation, and this came up in some of the feedback of our colleagues that are on advisory committees, national and international, and that is a bipolar patient who had 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 medications in order to reverse the depression part of the bipolar condition. She had had this condition for 14, probably more than that, 20 plus years. I had seen her through mostly depressive episodes, and she was on 5 medications, and they were not reversing it. So usually magnetic stimulation, which is a relatively new treatment, doesn't work with people with that kind of recalcitrant condition, but it worked. So on a stretch, she actually made a recovery, and I mean, it doesn't mean they don't relapse, but it's an example where here's a woman in her early 50s. You can think of, I during depressive episodes can get suicidal. Why am I doing this? And this was flagged as an issue that you were alluding to, is who would qualify if your brother, who was, let's say, 42 years old, said, Chris, I'm kind of done with it. I've done my 5 antidepressants. Because the perception was all they needed to do was have a physician and a patient decide, I've done enough treatment. There was no Canadian regulations that obliged a minimum set of treatments. It just said that they should have usual treatments or a failure of, correct me, Karin, if I'm on the wording on this, but it's clear on the implications, whereas that there was a low bar on what it would take for them to qualify. And in our field, no, that's not because what would work for me as a patient now, what would not work for me now could indeed work for me in a year. So I think it's really it's the way what makes the wonderful world of psychiatry and treatment so special is that we get to deal with these uncertainties. We aren't we don't run a gambit. We're not gamblers in the same way as our let's say our palliative care or our cancer treating, where we have that defined illness. So it makes our specialty particularly demanding of compassion, patience, understanding, and regard, because I think we are the holding pattern for many of these patients. The installation of hope. Dr. Yalom, one of his principles of treatment is the installation of hope. And I did an interview for a newspaper before, and that is one of our key ingredients. We need to be the carriers despite the burden, because what else is there? What else? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's so fascinating, Dr. Haggerty. Dr. Neufeld, did you have any follow-up on anything Dr. Haggerty raised?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that, of course, we have many, many wonderful examples that we could probably show. And probably this highlights some of the stigma that we have in our society around mental illness that, I kind of feel like, well, everybody must know someone who's gotten a whole lot better, like they were really bad and then they're a lot better. And then I'm thinking, well, no, usually those people don't tell anyone. So no one would actually know they had mental illness and that, the reason that they were having a rough patch was that they were ill and they needed to take medicines perhaps or get some kind of other kind of treatment. So I suppose that plays into this and in a way is it makes it so much more difficult for us to even convey our sense of hope. And I think one of our colleagues who was Dr. Jatinder Sareen, who was testifying in front of some of the senators, was really, I was quite shocked at how negative this particular senator was about mental illness and the hopelessness and the fact that we are fallible as psychiatrists and we can't get it right. And I thought that was pretty sad indeed. I think, in fact, not just psychiatrists. I know Dr. Haggerty and I are psychiatrists, so I keep talking about us, but I must stress there are many of us in mental health other than psychiatrists who also offer this hope.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we as physicians and leaders in terms of training other physicians have a special duty to make sure that we're thinking about the implications of these kinds of laws. So anyone hearing this, I want to be clear that the social workers and the mental health therapists of all kinds, including psychology and nursing, are very valuable in this really important endeavor to help people.
Correct. In fact, in my earlier conversation with Dr. Ramona Coelho, we pointed to a study with patients who suffered severe spinal cord injuries. And right after these patients received their diagnoses, there was a high level of suicidal ideation. But over time, with more interventions, the thought of suicidal ideation completely waned. And a year and a half after the initial diagnosis, no patient wanted to commit suicide. And that
Hmm.
was really fascinating because at that point, they had become adjusted to their new life, their new way of interacting with the physical world, and they were much more hopeful for the future. And
Hmm.
that was really interesting to show that even with, in some cases becoming a paraplegic, there still is that ability to adapt to your environment.
Hmm.
And can you imagine if you make these life decisions in an environment under certain circumstances, what that would mean for MAiD? There would be
Hmm.
a lot more people requesting MAiD in specific circumstances in the heat of the moment, quote unquote, instead of perhaps being provided a holistic psychiatric assessment as well as interventions for the long term.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, Chris, can I just make one point? I think that something that Jack has said is so important, and that's the therapeutics. I would coin it as the therapeutics of hope. And when you think about it fundamentally, all of us, all different sorts of specialists within medicine, as well as all sorts of disciplines within medicine, really that's what we have to offer patients. When patients are coming to the emergency room or coming to the hospital, they want, oftentimes we can't cure things, we can't take things away, but we can still offer hope that we won't desert people in their time of suffering. And I think that this law has somehow conflated killing the person with offering them hope and not letting them suffer alone. I think that is something that we need to continue teaching all of our medical students all the time, because that is one of our most important and fundamental tools as caregivers in health.
Dr. Haggerty, anything there?
Well, I think it's a whole conversation about the tolerance of suffering. I think that, as it has been implied, we're moving from a society that I was with some Ukrainians last night from the Ukraine, and you just couldn't help but think these people are tolerating very difficult circumstances, and they come here, and the what that we're ending the lives through this means, and the ability of the conversation not to be of tolerance of suffering or suffering skills. I mean, everybody, it's almost become mandatory reading of Man's Search for Meaning, like the reading of these inspirations of the wise tellers of wisdom of tolerance and suffering. And I think this somehow has been thwarted by um, the why would you let anybody suffer? It's unkind to let people suffer, and I think it's distorted the conversation. We've hijacked um, expectations of ourselves as a society by externally stating individual autonomy, and you don't need to suffer if you choose not to. And it's important to remind ourselves we're not entitled to end our life. That's not we can commit suicide, but we're not entitled to that. It's not a part of that. That's why we have in Ontario Form 1s. If people want to end their life and they post that on Facebook or otherwise, there's action taken on our part. There's so I think the ability of installation of hope and intolerance of, or the redefining what our society endorses, um, I think are critical junctures, and I welcome the time. It sounds like we need to have that conversation, and so I still hold optimism to the conversation will enrich us, because we're not the end of humanity. We are going to cycle through this and figure this out.
Dr. Haggerty, Dr. Neufeld, I wanted to explore this further with you. The term of consistency. I was reading a book recently, and the inspirational quote at the head of the chapter was, one of the hardest things humans can do is consistency. And it just struck me. It's like the hardest thing you could do is, eat healthy every single day. You could have the salad one time, but to have that every day is really challenging. How you know, demonstrate results, demonstrate actual psychological interventions can have positive impacts on people's lives. But it's that consistency piece. So going back to the example of some type of traumatic event happening in someone's life, a spinal cord injury, blindness, things like that, it can lead to despair, lack of hope, lack of seeing the future. How do you, in your practices and in your work with other psychiatrists, maintain that level of hope for your patients? And is that, in fact, something more and more public policy professionals and politicians should fundamentally understand in the study of psychiatry?
Well, I think that this is really a very important question, and it is about the fundamental aspects of what we bring as academicians in academic centers where we're actually training new practitioners and our professional societies, for example. I think that it's really important. And I think as far as an academic department is concerned, I think it's so important for us to show with, scientific methods, really what is our best evidence for helping people get better? So I think to be armed with knowing the latest evidence about treatments is very important. And this goes for any discipline, really, not just psychiatrists. This goes for all of our peers as well in other disciplines as well, or other specialties as well. So really understanding the evidence is very important. So being well read and being, trying to get the information from wherever you can is very important. But I think it's also part of that rigor where we are committed to our fundamental principles and values, which, as Jack has alluded to, we've been trained to save lives, not to take lives, not to be involved, for example, in capital punishment, never as a physician supposed to contribute to the state-sponsored death. That is something you're supposed to stay away from because you are a physician. You're about healing. You're about caring for people. And you're about, your role is actually in the hopefulness and going forward.
Wow. Dr. Haggerty.
Yeah. I think I'm going to pick up a few things, I'm going to. Your question was very interesting. You used the word consistency, and then you embedded the maintaining of hope. It's very interesting to combine those as phrases. What comes to mind is in our role as assessors is to kind of determine what are the coping strategies that an individual has. That's part of our assessment. As much as I'm going to ask someone about how their mood and sleep and appetite and are they hearing voices, I'm also going to ask, what do you do to feel good? What do you do to manage when you're under stress? So we look at the patterns, and our tasks are, and we learned this from 9/11. If I understand the some of the studies, it's been a while since 9/11, of course, is optimize what people already use. Ensure they optimize things such as their belief structures, such as their religious practices, such as they don't alienate from friends. So we don't separate them from family. We actually embed them back to the people that mattered. And usually it is friends and family that matters much for. And so I certainly think optimizing that. And the other is, it gets to the moral structure in which someone makes decisions. And I remember sitting down with Dr. Gand, Sanu Gand, who's one of our kind of leads colleagues, spokespersons, people on this. And he said, what is it about Canada? Why have we not valued life? And the last comment I'll make is if for those that are listening, is Indigenous health continuum, mental health continuum. If you look it up on the Thunderbird website, this document has at the core, so it has family, it has community, it has the 7 grandfather teachings, but at the center is meaning, hope, purpose, and belonging. And really, you can put even in the middle of that, the Great Spirit, God, or whatever it is. But I think, but to secularize it to meaning, hope, purpose, and belonging, as psychiatrists, every time we talk to someone, those things are touched upon in some ways. And I think those are critical components, in my opinion, that I often dip back to in order to say, hey, sounds like you're kind of low on the purpose. You lost your job. You don't have meaning. You and your wife kind of split. It sounds like you've alienated from family. Sounds like belonging is going to be critical. And we are redefining that's why I'm optimistic, is that it's mandating us to go back and say, okay, it's not about how many cars are in the driveway or how many puff jackets we got. It's about purpose, meaning, hope, and belonging. What does that mean now? So I think we get a unique privilege as psychiatry to say, Canada, what are we about? Let's go through this again. And I'm hoping that our medical colleagues will follow. And indeed, I think Canada has. The 7 provinces and 3 territories have, within a day of the decision, have followed. And we were alone with this, Chris. There were very few, almost, Karin, I don't know if there even was a professional group that was ready to back in October of 20, that was ready to go public and say, whoa, do we got this right? And look where we're at now. So I think reinserting meaning, hope, purpose, and belonging as factors, I think, has been a privilege, frankly, Christopher. So I think we are grateful as psychiatrists to do that.
Dr. Haggerty, Dr. Neufeld, I am very mindful of both of your time, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up access to care, because that to me is a major consideration when we start talking about MAiD. In the report back to the House of Commons that I alluded to, both of you signed on to in November 20, it states the geographic barriers that prevent access to mental health care and the lack of a mandate to ensure patients requesting MAiD for mental disorders have adequate treatment trials will result in patients in underserved areas obtaining MAiD instead of evidence-based care. I wanted to ask both of you, what are some of the barriers that exist right now in the prevention of mental health care access for patients across Canada?
I think that they're quite considerable, especially if you look at underserved, some of the rural areas. For example, Dr. Haggerty can certainly speak about Northern Ontario, as he's located in Thunder Bay. But, I'll tell you what, I think that we have problems with access to mental health care, even in the highly resourced areas. I'm situated at a very well-resourced academic center in Hamilton, Ontario. And I tell you, people still wait too long to get in. I think that we really need to do a whole lot more thinking about the system. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is where this advocacy that we've now been talking about stopping MAiD really should be really refocused on improving access throughout the country and really making a case for more spending. I think it is a matter of more spending, but it's actually a lot of thinking about the system that we need to have in place so that people can get care in a more timely fashion.
Dr. Haggerty.
Yeah, I mean, this is a subtle thing, Chris, in so much as, first of all, I'll reuse a term that's not mine, it's Paul Farmer's, but socialized to scarcity. I mean, the 3 of us, we kind of think, well, mental health, psychiatry, oh, well, it's going to take a year. So we've kind of been socialized to that. That doesn't make it right, but it just makes it so much of a part of our landscape. I certainly agree with what Dr. Neufeld said, is that it would be unconscionable for us to think, you heard the 2 stories that I shared and Karin's stories, is that it would be, it's really hard to think that we'd have a country that endorses death above access to clozapine, if they can't get TMS. I mean, what's the threshold? I mean, I work weekly with the far north fly-in communities, and these individuals will never have a psychiatrist sit in front of them, probably in their lifetime, if unless things change dramatically. They'll have a phone call or a video link, and probably even struggle with even rudimentary psychotherapy. So I think the opportunities of access are critical and are going to be pervasive. There is no fully functioning mental health system in the world. There is no place in the world where it's meeting the wait time expectations. Nonetheless, I do think we have made efforts to improve. We have made it a priority. At least people are stating it's a priority. Hospitals state it as key goals and strategic plans. So I think we've made headway. There's been excellent work done on the burden of illness and mental health, and I think that's been really important. Just use the example of major depression alone has more burden on society, the top 4 cancers that people suffer or die from. Just imagine that. Just one of our conditions equals the burden of one of our conditions, though it's one of our more common ones. So you add in, it's major depression. It's not even schizophrenia. It's not even the more common anxiety disorders. So I think we have a big hill to climb. Canada, on balance, underperforms probably by, correct me, Karin, but I think we're probably at least 30 to 40% below most countries that actually use MAiD for mental illness. So I think that the ability of enhancing, can we afford that kind of healthcare? Canada's choosing not to. So why would it? And it kind of reveals kind of a darker side to this. Why is that? What about the homeless that are applying? What happens if you have an Indigenous community and 7 18-year-olds decide to request MAiD, and they are would perceive like, what are we going to do with those things? So I think there's serious concerns, and that's why the pause, I think, is a great thing. We do have a government that has said we're pausing. Today it was said it was passed through Senate, and that was a concern for us. So it will be approved. I think it's whatever that's newly named C-17. So the indefinite delay or delay till 2027, I think, is good news for us, for Canada, and we have still some work to do. And on behalf of Karin and I know we're not done yet, but I just think having the attention like you're drawing, Christopher, and having longer conversations, with people like us is really valuable. And I'm been grateful to with this dialogue. It's a unique time for us.
Thank you, Dr. Haggerty, and the pleasure is all mine. But before I let both of you go, because I know this is really important, I wanted to shed light on something that, so in total transparency, I'm doing a series on MAiD. I spoke with Dying with Dignity Canada, and on their website, they have this statistic, and I want to pose this to both of you. It was a study done by Ipsos poll, and the reason I'm posing this to both of you is because we live in a time where politicians are counting the votes and they're moving on. So I want to share this with you thoughts. An Ipsos poll was commissioned by Dying with Dignity in 20, and it showed that a majority, 80% of people across Canada, support the notion that with the appropriate safeguards in place, an adult with the capacity to provide informed consent should be able to seek assessment for medical assistance in dying for a severe treatment-resistant mental disorder for which they experience intolerable suffering. So the question I'd like to ask both Dr. Haggerty and Dr. Neufeld is, what say you to Dying with Dignity Canada's Ipsos poll showing this treatment resistance access to MAiD for those that would like to access the service?
Well, I think as we've alluded to already, it would be very difficult for me as the psychiatrist to say there's no treatment for this condition. And that's where the devil is really in. Is it 2 failed antidepressants? Is it 3 failed antidepressants? Is it 6? Is it a treatment array? Who gets to decide what's treatment resistant? I think the better the psychiatrist, the better the outcome, or the more array of treatments that you have access to. But the way the law is written right now, or was just about to be implemented, was that the patient didn't even have to have any treatment if they didn't have immediate access to it. Hence the comment about, not being evenly meted out, this MAiD law. Mm-hmm. So again, I think it sounds good to people. The problem is when you get to know the people suffering with these conditions and you have an intimate knowledge of psychiatric care, you all of a sudden realize it's very difficult to define the irremediability or the lack of expectation that anyone will get better.
Dr. Haggerty.
Well, I think it was I call it the kindness trap. Oh, well, you would want your mother to do what she wants, wouldn't you? You would want your mother to have autonomy of decision making. You wouldn't want to deny somebody a loaf of bread. Well, no, but what led to those opportunities and scenarios? So I think there are there are circumstances, and the role of the challenge of policymaking is this applies to a population. It's not, we have to be careful on policy that has a population-based implications but needs to be applied individually. And I think that is one critique of this process. So I think for Dying with Dignity to say, well, you'd want to do the right thing for someone who is, suffering and is a threshold we probably reach from so many conditions, and Karin alluded to that. So I think it's an unfair tilted question. So I think but that's why we're in dialogue, frankly, and I think the dialogue deserves. Dying with Dignity has been critiqued as being one of the most well-funded advocacy groups, in Ottawa now, and I think it holds sway. It's influenced Parliament in a way that certainly is well beyond what us in the academic chairs or other professional groups I think probably should have. And what I mean is that on balance to other voices, and we've been a part of the checks and balances. So I think being able to voice these, and I regret Karin's visuals disappeared, but nonetheless, I think that this kind of dialogue needs to continue, Chris. So I thank you for speaking to us and on both sides of by the others as well in the dialogue.
Thank you, Dr. Neufeld. Thank you, Dr. Haggerty. This has been incredible. I want to share with you just a quick personal story. I myself have gone through financial loss recently, and I read a book by Edna Foa about stop obsessing, and it included a lot of activities, including exposure therapy. And over subsequent weeks of detailing the experience, writing out all my emotions, and reading that back morning, evening, every day for, I think I did that for about 5 or 6 weeks, my level of anxiety and stress that situation caused me dramatically went down. And now I don't even think about it. I think about it in a very positive way, and I'm very hopeful for the future. And so, to everybody listening, there is real firsthand experience
Mm-hmm.
with psychiatric
Mm-hmm.
evidence-based
Mm-hmm.
interventions, and I just find that to be so life-changing. So thank you so much for both of you and for your work in this field, for your advocacy in this field. I am a strong believer that more voices are necessary, and I'm really concerned that our public policy is being co-opted by external forces. And I'm doing everything I can with this podcast to make sure that more Canadians are aware of it. So thank you for your work. I'm so appreciative of your time.
Thank you, Chris, for just a wonderful interview, and it's been lovely getting to know you, and thank you so much for your work in this area.
No problem. Thank you.